Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the chief cook and bottle washer, Noel Armstrong. After the last episode, I wanted to delve a little more into the glitches in our cognition. Just get a few more examples of that into the canon of the History of Being Human podcast. Ways in which our mind filters and processes information that end up giving us a warped, distorted sense of reality. In the last episode, we only had time to cover a couple. One of them we talked about was apophenia, also known as patternicity, a faculty that is frankly way overdeveloped in some gamblers, all zealots, conspiracy theorists, astrologers, tea leaf readers, phrenologists, and haruspices. Now I can't claim I knew what that word was. Probably you've never heard of a haruspics before, but it's a great word. Go look it up. You'll never forget it. All of these depend to some extent on apophenia, the tendency to identify patterns where none exist, or to ascribe excessive significance and meaning to seemingly trivial argle-bargle. It's actually an adaptive and pro-survival trait much of the time, as we said, but one which can descend into costly and sometimes deadly errors, and has done so many times in history, because our brains aren't just excellent at recognizing patterns, not just good at finding meaning, but we are also excellent at generating patterns and meaning. We're meaning machines. We see purpose and agency and even entities behind everything that happens, especially when it happens to us. I also went over the phenomenon in which our brains get fooled into taking repetition for evidence, what's called the illusory truth phenomenon. Kind of the opposite of familiarity breeding contempt. Familiarity seems to breed credulity. We assent more readily and lend more credibility to assertions just because we've heard them repeated. And the upshot of this is rather disturbing. We can talk ourselves into things, and other people can talk us into things more than we would care to admit, more than I would care to admit anyway. And the reason for this seems to be nothing more than it's easier that way. Familiar statements require less effort to process. Our brains don't hurt as much. In this episode, I want to give a little attention to several other ways our minds mislead us. And I just want to say, far from this being a flaw in us, it's an unavoidable consequence of the way our brains try to order reality for us. Think about how much your brain has to grapple with from moment to moment, how much sensory data you are bombarded with at any given time. If you really break all that information down to its constituent elements, it can seem almost infinite. And really, it might as well be infinite because it's far, far more information than even our amazing brains are fast enough or complex enough to process. So there has to be a system or several systems to filter out the junk and focus on what will keep you alive, safe, fed, responsive, etc. In other words, we have to have a mechanism to make an overwhelming amount of data actually useful and intelligible to us. And the irony, I don't know if it's irony, but the unavoidable consequence is that the very mechanisms that help us come to grips with, help us relate to the universe around us, end up distorting that universe in the process. So we end up seeing the world and the universe in very particular ways that might not always match up with what we call objective reality. Hate to use that term, objective reality, such a loaded term, as if I know what that is. Let me just say it this way. Our brains show us the world and the universe in a particular way, and that way doesn't always align with the totality of available information and facts and physical properties of the world around us. But if this sounds pessimistic, again, let me just say, the good news is we can mitigate, at least to some extent, we can mitigate the effects of these distortions by knowing what they are, by being aware of them. And so that's the intention of this episode, to make us aware of some of the ways our minds distort reality. With this awareness, maybe we can avoid being duped by our own cognitive processes quite as often. To go through a list of some of the most common cognitive distortions and biases. And I'm not going to put these in any order of their relative importance or the catastrophic effects they might have or how commonly they manifest. Rather, I'm going to put this list in alphabetical order, which means that the first topic I'm going to talk about is the cognitive bias known as anchoring, also called focalism. Anchoring is a cognitive bias where the first piece of information you receive has a disproportionate level of influence over how you perceive everything else related to that comes after. In other words, the first piece of information you get becomes the anchor, And once that anchor is set, all the future information you receive, whether it's arguments, negotiations, estimates, values, are all discussed in relationship to that initial anchor. So the most common real-world examples are something that you will all recognize. Many of you have probably had the experience of traveling to a foreign land and being offered an object by a street merchant that you have no idea what the real value of that object is. So say you see a carved wooden elephant, you ask the merchant how much it costs, he says $100. If you end up getting that wooden elephant from the merchant for $50 or $30, you think you're getting a pretty good deal. You're being pretty smart because you're anchoring the value of that object to the initial offering price. And of course, if you're like me, it's only later that you see the same exact object for $3 or $4 at another stand. Or take another example. You begin a new job, and the first day your boss insults you or spits on you 7 times. After that, if you only get spit on 3 times during the day, you think it was a pretty good day. If you get beaten or spit on 10 or 12 times, you think that wasn't a very good day. Because again, your first judgment, your first experience, and I mean temporally, the first exposure you have to something influences your judgment of everything like that comes after it. And this is surprisingly influential and powerful, difficult to avoid, and surprisingly durable. What do I mean by that? Various studies have shown anchoring is difficult to avoid, even if the initial anchor, the initial value is absurd. So for example, in one study they have 2 groups of students. One group of students is asked whether Gandhi died before or after age 9. Well, these are students who know enough to know that age 9 is an absurd age. Gandhi had to be much older than 9 when he died. The second group of students was asked if Gandhi died before or after age 140. Also, again, an absurd value. He had to be much younger than 140 when he died. But here's the thing. Even though both of these anchors, both of these initial conditions set in these questions were obviously false, nonsensical in fact, they still had a powerful influence on students' estimates of how long Gandhi lived. In the group of students who were asked whether he died before or after age 9, the average guess for how long Gandhi lived was 50 years old. In the group of students who were asked whether he died before or after 140, the average guess for how long Gandhi lived was 67 years. Many other studies have shown the same effect, so even when you know that you're being offered a ridiculous price, it's difficult to avoid anchoring all future negotiations to that price. So these street vendors know what they're doing, even if it seems clumsy and transparent. It works. It's difficult to avoid anchoring effects. Now, the other thing I refer to is the fact that anchoring effects are durable. In fact, studies have shown that your initial anchor continues to influence your judgment weeks after you've formed it, even if you've been presented with a variety of contrary evidence. One example of that is people were told to look for a home in San Francisco for around $800,000. And as a result of that initial anchor, people thought every single home in San Francisco, because of course they cost much more than that, was overpriced, overvalued. Even after searching real estate ads for a week or two, they still considered homes overpriced and overvalued. If they were told to try to find a home in San Francisco for under $5 million, they found many homes that they thought were very good deals. And even after a week or two of research, they considered a home below $5 million a good deal. That's what I mean by saying the anchor effect is durable. It lasts through time and in the face of conflicting information. Moving on from anchoring to the availability heuristic. In the last episode, I defined a heuristic as a shortcut to knowledge, a shortcut to discovering something about the world around us. And that is true as far as it goes, but it's not the complete definition of a heuristic. Because a heuristic is not a shortcut that gets us to the essential truth of something. It's not perfect. It's not even rational. What a heuristic is a shortcut that gets us an approximation, gets us good enough working knowledge for a time to let us get by. When we don't have the time, energy, or inclination to find the optimal solution, we just employ a heuristic, something that's good enough. It's satisfactory for the time being. The reason we employ them is because they decrease our cognitive load. They decrease the time and resources it takes for us to arrive at a conclusion or a solution to a problem. And that's the nature of the availability heuristic. That's a heuristic or a bias or a shortcut where our judgments are unduly influenced by whatever comes most easily to mind, whatever is the most available to our minds. The philosopher William James described this heuristic, without naming it, this way, quote, The attention which we lend to an experience is proportional to its vivid or interesting character, and it is a notorious fact that what interests us most vividly at the time is, other things being equal, what we remember best." End quote. In other words, when we make decisions, we tend to be swayed by what we can remember. That makes sense. But what we remember is influenced by many things, including our presuppositions, our beliefs, expectations, and especially our emotions and feelings. So events that are very rare, like airliner crashes, vividly strike us because they are so terrifying. And because they have such a profound influence on our emotions, they are what we call to mind when we are assessing risk. So we get much more afraid of an airliner flight, even though statistically, as been pointed out many, many times, you're much more likely to die in a boring old auto accident. The same can be said for everything from shark attacks to home invasions. Because they strike us so forcefully and elicit such powerful emotions of fear, they're much more available to us when we are assessing risk than, say, falling off a ladder while you're hanging Christmas lights or whatever. The availability heuristic can substantially and unconsciously influence your judgment, and in this case, the media plays a key role. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman writes this, quote, "People tend to assess the relative importance of issues by the ease with which they are retrieved from memory, and this is largely determined by the extent of coverage in the media," end quote. And you can see this effect everywhere. Just one example. Last year, Northern California wildfires destroyed over 4 million acres, some of the worst wildfires in the history of California. At the time, Antifa was all the rage in the news headlines. So when people tried to come up with a reason for why it was such a bad forest fire season, to explain it to themselves, they went to the most available possible culprit. Not the most logical, not the most likely, just the one that struck their mind with the most force and imagery, and that was Antifa. Consequently, many people blamed Antifa for the Northern California wildfires, because that was the most readily available explanation. You'll notice there's a lot of overlap here with apophenia in conspiracy thinking. If you have a strong and vivid fear of a conspiracy, of a group of sinister people plotting to take over, then you're going to dramatically overestimate the likelihood that they're involved in any given situation. The same can be said for the devil and his minions, terrorists, aliens, whatever else can evoke that kind of strong visceral response in you. That's what's going to be the most available to you. And very often, it's no more complicated than the last thing you heard about. It's kind of the medical student phenomenon. If they've been studying a rare disease for 2 weeks, then they feel a symptom, they're much more likely to fear that they have that rare disease than probability would otherwise dictate. It's again the most available thing to them. It's right at the front of their brain, so to speak. So it's easy to see how this availability heuristic can lead us astray, distort our thinking. With that, let's move on to the letter B. We actually have 3 distortions that begin with the letter B. The first is the backfire effect. And let me just say, if I hadn't seen this so many times, I wouldn't believe it was a real thing. I have the illusion that people are fairly rational. When their beliefs are challenged with facts, they alter their opinions or beliefs and incorporate the new information into their thinking. But the truth is that very often there is a backfire effect, what I also call the double down effect, or psychological evidence proofing. Because the fact is that when people, and I don't exempt myself from this, when people are presented with evidence that contradicts an opinion or belief that they hold dear, that they have a personal investment in, not only does contradictory information not weaken that opinion or belief, it actually strengthens it. It's called the backfire effect because if you try to reason somebody out of a destructive or dangerous ideology or opinion or belief or conspiracy theory or cult involvement, whatever it is, if it's something near and dear to them and you try to reason them out of it, it very often backfires. The more evidence you present that contradicts their opinion, the stronger they become convinced of the correctness of their opinion. And that's because, as Steve Rathje said, identity trumps reason every single time. People's affiliation with some community of opinion is much more near and dear to them than mere facts. We're very good at ignoring facts that don't fit what psychologists call our narrative scripts. Essentially, the stories we tell ourselves because we want to tell them to ourselves. They fit what we think about ourselves and about the world around us. Anything that doesn't fit within our narrative script is either rejected or reinterpreted to reinforce our narrative script. For those of you who doubt the validity of this backfire effect, let me ask you one question. Have you ever won an argument online? And by that I mean, have you ever changed the opinion of somebody who was arguing with you online? Or did you just exchange facts back and forth, become more and more convinced of your own correctness, as your opponent did also, and eventually descend into all-out ad hominem attacks and name-calling? Because I think we all know which way these things go every single time. Let me just say this. If you ever have successfully changed somebody's opinion online, my hat's off to you. I'm in awe of you, because that is a vanishingly rare phenomenon. So that's the backfire effect. A doubling down, a retrenchment that flies in the face of common sense and reason, that makes progress impossible in many cases, that drives a deep wedge between people of otherwise goodwill, and maintains conditions of separation and division, and very often violence. The next glitch I want to talk about is the Barnum effect. And if you guessed that it's named after P.T. Barnum, you're not wrong. The term was originally coined in 1956 by the psychologist Paul Meehl, who saw evidence that the showman P.T. Barnum used this technique. He described what he called Barnum statements. A Barnum statement is when you look at somebody in the audience and you tell them something about themselves, which is actually so general that it would apply to anybody in the entire audience. But because you're looking at and singling out that one person, they think that statement is especially relevant to them. Work on this Barnum effect actually goes all the way back to 1948, what has been described as the seminal or classic experiment on the topic. The psychologist Bertram Forer gave a psychology test to 39 of his students. He tells them he's going to generate a brief personality sketch based on their answers to this test. So they take the test. A week later, Forer comes back with each person's individual personality sketch. He asks them to all review the information and describe how accurate it was, how well that sketch applied to them individually. Well, you can probably already guess where this is going. Every single student received the same identical personality sketch with the following descriptions. Number 1, you have a great need for other people to like and admire you. Number 3, you have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. Number 4, while you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Number 5, your sexual adjustment has presented problems for you. Number 7, at times you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or done the right thing. Number 8, you prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. Number 9, you pride yourself as an independent thinker and do not accept other statements without satisfactory proof. Number 10, you have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. Number 12, some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic. And number 13, security is one of your major goals in life. So basically, almost absolutely content-free statements about their personality. And on the average, on a scale from 0 to 5, 5 being excellent, students gave it a 4.3, a fantastic showing by Dr. Forer's personality inventory, despite the fact that every single student had the exact same profile. I quote that study at length because if you listen to those answers, basically you can't read a daily horoscope in the newspaper without seeing those kinds of statements over and over again. And the fact is that many astrologers, fortune tellers, and psychics use the Barnum effect to their advantage. And frankly, I bring this up mostly because I think it's interesting. I don't think it's overly pernicious. You might lose a few bucks or get suckered into something, but I don't think the Barnum effect has caused a huge amount of suffering in the universe. Write to me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com if you can think of any example of the Barnum effect causing mass suffering. In fact, you could probably employ the Barnum effect in your personal life. Say you're at some party, talk to somebody for a while, then throw out a Barnum statement to them. Really impress them. Something like, you strike me as an independent thinker and don't accept the opinions of others without satisfactory proof. So that's the Barnum effect. As we talk about these, you're going to notice a lot of overlap between various distortions. And as a case in point, I'm going to talk next about belief bias or belief effect. And this is a little harder to explain. This has to do with how persuaded we are by an argument. And on the one hand, it's trivially obvious. That is, if we agree with the conclusion, we're much more likely to accept that the argument is sound, that the premises are true, and that the conclusion follows from the premises. If we disagree with the conclusion of an argument, we're much more likely to consider the argument unsound, meaning false premises or conclusions that don't follow from the premises. So to put it very briefly, if we already agree with the conclusion, then we're much less inclined to care about how we got to that conclusion. It doesn't take a sound argument to convince us of something we already believe. But it goes beyond that. In fact, it's so powerful that if we are presented with an argument that we can't even comprehend, we have no idea whether the premises are true or whether there was a valid format in presenting the argument. It doesn't matter. If we like the conclusion, we will agree that it has been soundly proven, despite the fact that the entire argument was totally out of our grasp. So this might be sounding a lot like the backfire effect to you, and it does have some similarities, but the backfire effect is contradictory information reinforces us in our cherished beliefs. But the belief bias or the belief effect has to do with our acceptance of arguments. So let me put a real-life example to you. From my own experience, I'm just going to own up to this. In my own reading and studies, I've come across many arguments for and against freedom of the will. If I were to totally objectively evaluate the two arguments, I would say that the arguments against freedom of the will are more sound than the arguments for freedom of the will. The premises seem undeniable, and the conclusions follow from the premises. And yet, I'm much more likely to find arguments for freedom of the will convincing. Why is that? Because I have the subjective sensation that at any given moment, I have multiple paths that I could choose, multiple options which I could freely avail myself of. And because of this, I'm much more likely to think that some form of sophistry is being played on me by the arguments against free will, because they don't match my own subjective experience that I am free. And so in this case, that's belief bias. I can follow the arguments against freedom of the will all the way through. I can accept all of their premises as true. I can accept their form as valid. And yet when it comes to the conclusion, I just can't quite accept it, because my beliefs about my own experience are otherwise. And of course, it's not just in our personal life where this plays out. It's politics, it's advertising, it's so-called objective studies. They are plagued by belief bias. One study will prove the efficacy of prayer in healing from illness, while another study will prove it's all just the placebo effect. One study will prove the catastrophic effects of pornography on individuals in society, and another study will document no harm and actually show some benefits. As hard as it is to believe, even scientists and researchers at times allow their own personal beliefs to bias their conclusions, their arguments. The next effect I want to talk about is the so-called bystander effect. I'm only bringing this up for historical purposes. Or to put it more precisely, I'm only bringing this up so that I can put it to rest. You've probably all heard of the bystander effect, maybe not by name. It's a phenomenon that's filled the pages of textbooks for years, and yet very probably doesn't even exist. First, what is it? The bystander effect claims that an individual is much less likely to offer help to another person in need if there are other people around. So if there's one person seeing another person in distress, they're very likely to offer help. But if 2 or 3 or 10 people are watching another person in distress, the odds go up that no one will offer help. The event that triggered the most interest, the most research on this supposed phenomenon, was the murder of Kitty Genovese in March of 1964. According to an article in the New York Times, 38 witnesses, all in all, watched Kitty Genovese walking home to her apartment in Queens, New York at 3 a.m. and saw or heard her getting stabbed, sexually assaulted, and eventually murdered. And none of those 38 people lifted a finger to help. None of them did anything. So said the article in the New York Times. And that's the incident many of you have probably heard of in your freshman psychology classes. It's thought to be the prime example of the bystander effect. That article in the New York Times didn't just become a public sensation. It also triggered numerous professional psychological papers, newspaper editorials, research studies, and eventually made its way into the canon of psychological literature. It almost became a truism that if you were in trouble, you better hope there was only one person witnessing it, because if there were many witnesses, nobody was going to intervene. Your odds went way down that somebody would try to help you. And to this very day, you'll see the bystander effect listed in psychological textbooks, along with numerous very reasonable and rational explanations over why this phenomenon occurs. Things like shared responsibility, bystander apathy, and this is all well and good. It's a beautiful theory, but unfortunately, it is destroyed by an inconvenient fact, and that is that it's probably not real. In the first place, an article published in American Psychologist in 2007 found that the story of Genovese's murder had been greatly exaggerated by the media. There were far fewer than 38 eyewitnesses. The police were actually called at least once during the attack. Many of the bystanders who overheard the attack couldn't actually see the event. They didn't know what was going on. So the original article had almost portrayed it as 38 people standing around a girl getting murdered and doing nothing, not even lifting a finger. So that was greatly exaggerated, a sensationalized misreporting of what actually occurred. But far worse for the claimed bystander effect is the fact that in 2019, a cultural anthropologist, Marie Rosenkrantz-Lindegaard, led a large multinational study where they analyzed 219 actual street disputes. And what Lindegaard and her team found was directly contrary to the supposed bystander effect. In those 219 disputes, witnesses intervened almost every time, and the odds of an intervention went up with the number of bystanders. According to Dr. Lindegaard, quote, "This study is the first large-scale test of the bystander effect in real life. Up until now, this effect was mainly studied in the lab by asking study subjects how they might respond in a particular situation. Another striking aspect of this study is that the observations come from 3 different countries, including the violent country of South Africa, where intervening in a street dispute is not without risk. That appears to indicate that this is a universal phenomenon." End quote. So the fact is that people will intervene when another human being is in distress, even if they have to risk their own personal safety to do so. So until somebody does a larger or better study than Lindegaard's, which doesn't seem likely, we must relegate the bystander effect to the graveyard of obsolete psychological theories, where it can lie in ruins with pretty much everything Sigmund Freud ever wrote. To paraphrase Emerson, let the bystander effect be gazetted and ridiculous henceforward. Moving on in the alphabet of cognitive distortions, we come next to the confirmation bias. We talked about that in the last episode, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Confirmation bias is obvious. The examples are legion, and we all suffer from it. It is the all-too-human tendency to seek out and assign more weight to evidence that confirms opinions that you want to be true, or those that confirm what you already believe. And if the evidence is ambiguous, you see it as confirmation for your position, even if it's nothing of the kind. And this wonderful faculty of ours allows 2 people of totally polar opposite opinions about a topic to each become more and more entrenched, even if they were to listen to the same facts from the same source. The confirmation bias affects many facets of the truth-seeking endeavor. The interpretation of facts, the search for facts. You look harder for facts that confirm your own opinion than you do for those that disconfirm it. But what I find the most striking is the fact that it also affects our memories. You remember facts that confirm your cherished beliefs far better than you remember facts that disconfirm them. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the effect is the strongest when you feel emotionally charged about a topic, when it's something near and dear to your heart. So that's confirmation bias. It's a biased search for information, biased interpretation of the information you find, biased recall, memory recall of information. Confirmation bias is probably the most polarizing, the most divisive thought distortion, because look at its real-world effects. Even when 2 people who disagree are exposed to the same information, they become even more entrenched in their belief. So attitude polarization. It also allows for the perseverance of beliefs, such that even if you show somebody their reasons for holding a belief are false, they won't give those beliefs up. That's belief perseverance. It also leads to poor reasoning, what's called false correlation or illusory correlation, wherein people see a connection between ideas or events that they would normally not see. Normally they would be able to weigh evidence and reason well if it weren't about a topic that they already had a huge emotional and personal investment in. But once they have that emotional investment, they lose the ability to reason objectively. They begin to correlate things that aren't correlated. All of this is pretty obvious, and confirmation bias is absolutely everywhere. I suffer from it, and I would dare say most of you listening to this podcast suffer from it also. But we can be more or less aware of it. And you've probably already noticed one negative effect of social media is to amplify confirmation bias. It's very easy using social media to put yourself into a filter bubble, into a little echo chamber. Then you don't even have to process and weigh evidence in a biased way. You never even get contrary evidence. Everything you hear and everything you read confirms what you already think. The problem with confirmation bias is that it leads to bad decisions, and that can be on the grand scale. I'm talking massive suffering. How could Mao have possibly thought the Great Leap Forward was a great idea, even when it was failing disastrously all around him, if he didn't surround himself with a narcissistic echo chamber of yes men and refused to take into account all of the evidence that proved his system was failing? How could Hitler have run Germany into the ground if he had actually weighed the facts that were right there before him? But this happens on the personal level also. Everything from buying a vehicle to gambling to investing in the stock market, many of these decisions we make under the influence of a hearty dose of confirmation bias, and the immediate result is overconfidence. And the long-term result is we very often fail to achieve what we set out to do, or suffer. One of my favorite examples of confirmation bias is pyramidism or pyramidology. The Great Pyramid at Giza is it's an impressive structure. It's not surprising then that some people would consider it almost supernatural, or beyond the capability of early civilizations to create. And that sense of wonder and awe that it inspires is great as far as it goes. The problem is people think they can find encoded secret messages in the measurements of the Great Pyramid, especially if you measure the Great Pyramid in what is called pyramid inches, which is 1/25th of a sacred cubit. I'm not making this up. In fact, the sacred cubit and the holy half yard are about the most pious measurements out there. But the amazing thing is, if you equate 1 British inch to 1 solar year, you come up with some amazing predictions, just as long as you're measuring the right part of the pyramid. You can predict the exodus of the children of Israel out of Egypt, the crucifixion of Jesus, World War II, World War I, the Civil War, the founding of modern-day Israel in 1948, and all the way out to Armageddon. And the beauty of it is, if your measurements aren't matching up, if the ratio is completely off for all of those events, you can just go measure another part of the pyramid. Pyramidology has been around since the 1800s, and it still turns up from time to time every so often. As early as 1880, the world-renowned Egyptologist Flinders Petrie goes to Egypt to check this whole theory out. He measures the pyramid, compares it to the measurements of the early pyramidologists, and declares that all bunk. They measured the pyramid completely wrong, and what's even more fatal to the pyramidologist theory, there's no such thing as a pyramid inch in antiquity. He writes this, quote, "There is no authentic example that will bear examination of the use or existence of any such measure as a pyramid inch or of a cubit of 25.025 British inches. So not only does he shoot down the pyramid inch, he even takes on the sacred cubit. Of course, the pyramidologists responded vigorously, pointing out all kinds of problems with Petrie's argument. Petrie had had enough. He didn't engage again. He just wrote this, quote, "It is useless to state the real truth of the matter, as it has no effect on those who are subject to this type of hallucination. They can but be left with the flat earth believers and other such people to whom a theory is dearer than a fact." End quote. What a great statement. What a concise summary of one form of confirmation bias. So that's confirmation bias. There are so many examples, and so much has been said and studied and written about confirmation bias, but alas, we have to move on. The next bias in alphabetical order is called the curse of knowledge. You've probably all experienced this either from one side of the equation or the other. Because the curse of knowledge is this: once you know something and it becomes part of your knowledge base, you assume that other people know the same thing because you know it so well, and you can't even remember a time when you didn't know it. And you forget all the steps between not knowing it and knowing it that you had to pass through. And I think we've all had or been that teacher, doctor, or engineer who talked to us as if we already knew what they were talking about when we really had no idea. It's a really interesting phenomenon. We often think people are brilliant when they speak in a way that we don't understand, when the truth is it takes far greater emotional and general intelligence to explain things in a way that other people can understand. To not only know things, but to know how you know them, why you know them, and be able to communicate that to someone else effectively. people, and I say especially teachers, who get frustrated and dismissive when you can't understand what they're saying. As if you're playing some kind of game of Pictionary and they're mad that you're not guessing their clues. Really are falling prey to the curse of knowledge bias. Moving on from the C's to the D's, let's talk about declinism. That name, declinism, comes from a book by Oswald Spengler, a historian. He wrote the book in 1918, and in this book he argued that everything used to be better and everything's getting a whole lot worse. So this is kind of the cogently argued professional historian's argument for why all the old guys sitting around the VFW lodge complaining about how things used to be so much better are actually right. And the fact is, past a certain age, it's almost universal to think that the past was better than the future is going to be. Certainly smacks of that golden age story that's so common in romantic poetry. But the effect has been studied in corporate culture, politics, religion. In fact, what is apocalyptic theology except one variation of declinism? The world is becoming more and more wicked, and God is just going to have enough of it at one time. He's not going to put up with it anymore. People are going too downhill, too depraved. In fact, this is the idea that Steven Pinker countered in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, wherein he showed that by almost any variable that really matters, that really affects human flourishing, the world is actually getting better and better. Women's rights, slavery, living standards, education, all of these parameters show that we're actually getting better and better. But the cognitive bias of declinism has us see it otherwise. Now, I will say this. One major catastrophe, such as a major world war, nuclear holocaust, some kind of natural disaster that changes conditions on the planet, and Pinker's thesis will be obsolete. It will be destroyed by an ill-fitting fact. And then the declinists will have the last laugh, I guess. The next cognitive bias I want to cover is called the framing effect. Imagine if you took a Da Vinci and placed it in a truck stop restroom in a plastic frame somewhere over the toilet. Most, if not all people's perception of that work would be influenced by the way in which it was presented. And conversely, if you took a work of high schlock, say a Thomas Kinkade, no offense, but you put a Kinkade in a gilded frame in its own special room in the Louvre, that would also affect the way people value that work. Well, the same thing happens with decor and clothing and food and ideas. The framing effect is the cognitive bias where people judge ideas not based on their own intrinsic merit, but based on how they are presented. And there are many studies on this effect. For example, if you're trying to promote an economic policy, studies have shown that it's much more effective to talk about an increase in the employment rate than it is to talk about a decrease in the unemployment rate. So it could be the exact same numbers on either side, but if you emphasize the wrong thing, people are less likely to assent to it. 10 million more people having a job sells much better than, say, hypothetically, 1% fewer unemployed people. The framing effect is a cognitive bias that applies to all kinds of different situations. You might already know that if somebody asks you how they look in a certain pair of pants, you never say, "That's worse than the other pair." Instead, you say, "I like the other pair better," because you know that's going to go over better. That's framing bias at work. You're conveying exactly the same information. When people sign up for classes, for example, there's usually a penalty for signing up late and a discount for signing up early. Studies have shown that you'll get many, many more people to sign up early if you emphasize the penalty for late sign up than if you emphasize the discount for early sign up. It's the exact same information. If you entered it into a computer that didn't suffer from framing bias, it wouldn't matter which way you presented it, which way you framed it. The computer would arrive at the same conclusion. Not so with human beings. The way you ask the question, the way you present the data, has a profound effect on how we interpret it and how we favor certain things over others. Nothing really revolutionary about that. We all see it all around us all the time. We know it happens. We know that lawyers, advertisers, politicians are experts at making things appealing or unappealing through framing. But studies have shown that even though we're aware of it, we can't escape it. Another interesting thing about framing bias is the effects of framing bias increase with age. Don't really know why that is, but the older we get, the more affected we are by the way things are presented to us, especially financial and healthcare decisions. And just one more point about the framing effect. If you learn a second language, you're much less vulnerable to framing effects in the second language than you are in your native tongue. And it might be because the second language has less impact, less emotional impact on you than your own native tongue. It might also be that you have to pay more attention to understand what's being said in a second language. So you have to bring more cognitive resources to bear so you pay better attention. So that's the framing effect, the cognitive bias known as the framing effect or framing bias. The next cognitive bias that I want to talk about is so foundational, so central, that it's actually called the fundamental attribution error. And this is something we all live every single day of our lives. When you're driving behind somebody going 10 miles below the speed limit, your first thought is, that person is an idiot. The way they're driving is evidence of a character flaw, in other words. You don't look for some situation that would explain their driving behavior. Maybe they got distracted for a second or two. Maybe they're worried about something with their car. It's making a weird noise. You don't think that way. No, they're an idiot. That's the natural knee-jerk default position in that situation. 10 minutes later, you look at the rearview mirror. You see a car tailing you closely. You look at your speedometer and realize you're going 10 miles below the speed limit. Believe it or not, most people in that situation don't say, I'm an idiot. No, they look at the situation. Oh, I got distracted for a few seconds. The other person going 10 miles below the speed limit is evidence of a problem with their character. Me going 10 miles below the speed limit is due to the situation. That's the fundamental attribution error. When we do something, it's because of the situation. When other people do things, it's because of who they are. So in other words, we seek situational explanations for our behavior and character-based explanations for behavior we observe in other people, which is kind of related to the saying that we judge other people by what they do, by their actions. Their actions show who they are, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. Yes, I did that, but I had a reason to do it. I'm a good person. That's not who I am. We don't extend that same courtesy to other people. So the upshot is you could be doing the same thing as somebody else, and you're judging them for it, saying that's a reflection of their character, but it's not a reflection of your character. So that's why it's called a cognitive distortion or a cognitive bias. It doesn't just distort our understanding of what's going on in the world around us. It distorts our interpersonal relationships. The psychologist who described the fundamental attribution error first, Lee Ross, thought it was so important that he said the fundamental attribution error forms the conceptual bedrock for the entire field of social psychology. And there are a lot of theories for why we do this. I'm not going to get into all of them, but the one that I find the most compelling and the most interesting is called the salience of the actor. That is, when we see an effect, we look for a cause. When we're watching the behavior of other people, it's the people themselves that we focus on. They become what's called the primary reference point. We don't look for all the little situations. They don't grab our attention and our focus as much as the primary reference point, which is the people. Because we're so focused on people, we don't see the other situational factors that might be at play. When we observe ourselves, we're much more aware not just of ourselves as this one undivided whole, like we see other people. We see within ourselves motivations, rationales, forces acting on us that we don't see when we're looking at the behavior of others. This is called fundamental, not just because it's fundamental to the field of social psychology, but it's also a very hard bias to transcend, to overcome. It's almost hardwired in us. It's only rarely that you find a soul so sagacious, so wise and generous, that they attempt to overcome this bias. They attempt to extend situational explanations to others with the same generosity that we extend them to ourselves. I have to really admire people like that. Probably makes them happier people too. Think about how much anger the fundamental attribution error causes you. It's so much easier to get furious and angry with somebody who is just an idiot than with a situation. And at the risk of getting out of character for the History of Being Human podcast, this topic reminds me of what is probably my favorite Zen story, the story of a man who paints his boat with a fresh coat. It looks beautiful. He's so happy with it, he takes it out on the lake even though it's foggy outside. As he's paddling around the lake, he sees another boat approaching through the fog. He realizes that boat is going to hit his freshly painted boat, so he yells. The boat doesn't turn away. The boat keeps coming for it. So he screams, he shakes his fist, he shouts, he curses, and yet the boat continues coming and rams right into him. He is furious, livid, beside himself. That idiot just rammed into his boat. But as his focus gets a little better, he realizes the other boat is empty. There's nobody in it. And immediately his anger subsides. It's a situation, not a character defect. That's the fundamental attribution error in a nutshell right there. According to Chuang-Tzu, if a man is crossing the river and an empty boat collides with his skiff, even though he is a bad-tempered man, he will not become very angry. But if he sees a man in the other boat, he will scream and shout and curse at the man to steer clear. And of course, the moral to this parable is, you'll have a lot more peace in your life, a lot less anger, if you look for situational explanations, if you see every boat as empty, even if there is a person in the other boat. Look for the situation, not the person, not the character defect that drove it. I'm going to end there. This is the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Hope you have a good couple of weeks till I get back with the rest of the episode on cognitive biases, thought distortions.